we're now going to proceed with our high-level panel and the actual discussion. This is news to no one, and I think it's very clear from the two presentations that we just heard that Africa is far from meeting critical SDGs, namely when it comes to the issue of poverty. More generally, and we also heard that in the opening ceremony, the world is grappling with multi-level crises, a succession of disruptive shocks that have particularly weighed on the socioeconomic growth momentum of developing economy. As nations across the world are faced with conflicts and the catastrophic humanitarian crises that they result in, money is being diverted from development to peacekeeping. But SDGs remain a priority for Africa, and it's become unequivocally clear that we cannot keep a business-as-usual approach to achieving them and implementing them. We have to think creatively, and this challenging moment is an opportunity to offer solutions to move forward in a resilient, innovative, and sustainable way. Thankfully, we have a panel of brilliant experts who are going to offer their perspective in a high-level conversation that we hope will be candid, interactive, and enticing. And now, without further ado, I'm going to welcome our esteemed panelists, starting with the Minister of State for Planning and Development of Ethiopia, Nimera Gebeyehu. If you could just join me on the stage, and if you could please give him a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. We also have Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Africa, Madame Cristina Duarte, who will be also speaking this high-level panel number one. Thank you. If you could give it a little bit more enthusiasm, ladies and gentlemen. With us, to UNDP Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa, Madame Ahuna Eziakonwa, who will also be part of this panel. We also have Executive Director of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, that is Mitika Mwenda. There you go, a little bit more enthusiasm from this side. And then finally, last but not least, he will be joining us on Zoom, if I'm not mistaken. That is Group President and Managing Director of Eastern and Southern African Trade and Development Bank, Mr. Admasu Tadese. I think just to begin for this first ARFSD high-level panel, focused on stepping up ambition and innovative solutions to eradicate poverty and reinforce the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Agenda 2063, that is the Africa we want, of the Africa Union. I'll first throw it to our esteemed panelists quite plainly to kick us off. How do we make progress and implement our development agendas, and how do we do it differently and effectively? And we'll begin with you first.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to stand by the protocols as established. So I have been listening to all the presentations, all the speeches since morning, and even the very beautiful presentations by the two presenters. So I'm just reflecting and asking myself, so as Africa, where are we? Why do we have all these challenges? We have attended meetings after meetings. When I look, this is the 10th Africa Forum Sustainable Development. And really, I have attended, I think, the previous, even more than 5, successfully. But when we come, we start with a very beautiful presentation, very high level. We go to presentations, and eventually, it just becomes the same ritual. It just becomes, the same, we repeat policy after policy. When you look at the Agenda 2063, and you look at Agenda 2030, very elaborate, very good data from the ECA, analysis from any institution will not lack that. But the question we ask ourselves, then why are we not reversing on the goals, on what we have found here? And the answer, I think we have, is, as Africa, we need to ask ourselves, where are we? Are we on the table in setting the global agenda, or are we part of the meal? So that's question number one. Number two, looking at Africa's place in global geopolitical interactions. You see, everything is set out there. And you have to, looking at the Agenda 23, I once attended a meeting which was expected in South Africa to discuss the Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030. And we were invited randomly. It was hosted by the African Union and the UNDP. Tragically, no one was talking about Agenda 2063 as Madame has mentioned. Everybody is obsessed with Agenda 2030. I was very embarrassed. And because you ask yourself, are you more interested with New York or Addis Ababa? Because that's the point. So as we speak, we have to ask ourselves as Africans, so who sets our agenda, and do we have ownership of our institutions and the processes? And if we have, why have we not been able to own a process as important as this? And this brings me to the issue then of the means of implementation, the resources. Resources is very important. And as long as we are in control of our resources, forget it. Both whether it is in international climate finance and whether in the implementation of Agenda 2030, the 17 goals, just forget it. I just reflect, and I heard President Kagame talking about this again. When you go at the African Union, you look at all the buildings there. Who are constructed? Are they constructed by Africa? So that you know the fundamental problem which we have. The tallest building, you know the owner. The peace and security building, you know the owner. And that is how the agenda is set. It is that serious. And so, as an African, I feel embarrassed when I go to the COP28. And the key agenda there, first day which was being done there, was the loss and damage fund. And this, everybody was really obsessed. How are we going to get money? And all the time, you know, agenda is set, and then you fall into it. So day one, the UAE, it was navigated its contribution so that we are blinded on the bigger issue. So at the end of the day, before anything started, we have delivered $700 million for loss and damage. And that's a global fund. Everybody was clapping. As the civil society, we refused to clap. Because why? This $700,000, I'm finishing.
No, I just want you to have time to also respond to the first question. But
so what I'm saying is you go there because you know the issue, whether we talk about all the semantics and the presentation and everything, without talking about money, then there's nothing we are doing. And so, look, that 700, yesterday, the day before yesterday, the United States of America, Senate, House, passed just $95 billion just to fund the war in Ukraine, to kill people in Hamas and in Taiwan. And when you can see they are not able, they contributed just $17 million just for loss and damage, and budget which cannot fit even my country. So where are we? We need to be serious. And now, I hope I'll get another opportunity because I know I have the answer for you. The answer, we have the answer here, and we are going to have it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your first thoughts and for sharing them with us. I'm now going to give you the floor, the Minister of State for Planning and Development of Ethiopia. And again, the first question was just to set us off and to sort of think in a more concrete way as to how we can effectively implement the SDGs that are mainly in this particular panel, which is eradicating poverty.
Good afternoon. I think I would like to first reflect on the point, my gentleman raised. I think sometimes it's good to be also in balance and recognize the efforts of such platforms. Yes, I do recognize that we're talking about two agendas, but pretty much really, the same substance matter. If you look into, the aspirations that the Madam Deputy Commissioner was explaining earlier, looking into the sustainable development goals.
تحدثت عن التنمية المستدامة.
Yes, so these are, pretty much the same agendas. And also we have this huge, capacity efforts provided by, the UN, the African Union, departments, in terms of, really aligning, our priorities and development planning frameworks. So how national initiatives are aligned, at the regional level, and also how these, national and regional levels are aligned with the global, sustainable development goals. I think we are all speaking, the same agenda, the same problem, the same issue, especially when it comes to, Africa and most of, the member states. I think one of the main issues, we were having, in terms of the discussion is that in terms of our targets, be it looking from, Agenda 2063 or Sustainable Development Goals, even be it, within certain, national development aspirations, we are lagging behind in terms of our, priorities. If you take, the first two goals of, Sustainable Development Goals, which really aligns with the first, aspirations of the African agenda about, creating so inclusive economic growth, inclusive prosperity. These are, at the heart of this is how we are doing well with the poverty reductions, across, member states in most countries. And in terms of the factors, I think we are, on the same page in a sense that we are lagging behind, and a collective action problem is there, be it at the regional level and also, global scale. Actually, the presentation that we had with Madam Hanan only showed, few goals. If you look, the broader indicators of the Africa Agenda 2063 and the SDG, only 15% is on track. About 40% is off track. In a sense, in most of the indicators, we are actually, regressing backward, looking in relation to, 2015 baseline data. And this is really, pertinent issue that we need to, be on the same page, on the way in which we look at this problem. So coming back to the question, for me, I think, given the capacities out there across, many state members, and also the financial challenges most economies are facing, I think prioritizing our actions is really important in that regard. For me, probably, from Ethiopian perspectives, some of the cases, we always say that the first two goals on which we are regressing, so fast, looking into our food system is one of the most, priority issues we'll be looking. Also, that is, in relation to the climate challenges that we are facing. Most of, African, food systems are rain-fed, dependent on rainfall, and the problems that we face in terms of the unpredictability of, the rainfalls that we get. At times, also the extreme, weathers in terms of droughts are affecting most of, households at the very local level. So, for me, if you're asking me if you can put, priorities in that regard, working collectively on climate smart, food productions is really important, because the first two goals that we've seen earlier are largely dependent on the food sectors of the economy. The second most important, actually, probably this is very pertinent to African continent, is we are also regressing on our peace-building efforts. In most of, African case, of course, the global, wars and conflicts are affecting, the global financial architecture in terms of, diverting the flows of resources to, other priorities. Within the African context, also at the very local level, a factor that is really, significantly correlated to the household welfare is the conflict issues that needs to really take, a priority action. And of course, Madam Deputy Commissioner earlier said that prevention is most, cheaper in most cases, and most African countries should work on, institutional beings to avoid conflicts. But also the conflicts within which most African countries are struggling needs to really take, a concrete, actions at the African level, trying to really, give a piece, a shot, so that, societies can have. And we talk about after that about, business environment, investment environment, undertaking our economic, plans effectively on the ground. I think the last approach I would, like to echo the last point probably is the financing issue. I think when we speak about financing, of course, we always talk about this idea of innovative financing. I think one of the most important issues that Africans need to really, take into consideration, two peculiar nature of African economies. The first one is about, the nature of the private sector, to which the prospect of, raising financing private sector is really limited. And most African countries, struggle with that similar problem. The second nature is about, the capacity of the state to collect, taxes and to raise, revenues to finance, development issues. I think this really requires a collective action in terms of, coming together and trying to devise really, not only at the very global level, at the regional level, also have, our development, financing structures work really towards that phenomena. And the other disappointing aspect, of course, most of the opening remarks we had in the morning, be it from the African perspective, the UN, I think we are on the same page. The global financial architecture is not working. I was just sitting there and looking in a figure from Ethiopian context. Over the last 5 years, the debt service obligation that we had as a country is close to 10 billion. And if you see the new development finances coming to Ethiopia, is exactly the same. So the net, flows to these African economies is pretty much, becoming negligible. And talking about such, global commitments towards eradicating poverty, eradicating conflict, and achieving our two agendas really require, concretizing the actions that we put. That the gentleman also said that we often talk on so many, platforms, pledges, but concretizing these reforms is really important. And I think these three are more important in terms of, prioritizing and bringing a transformative results. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. You touched on several points, and you've namely addressed the issue of financing, which we'll be going into in a much more detailed way, hopefully, as we advance in the conversation. I'm now going to give the floor to a UNDP, Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Africa, Madame Duarte, with the same question: and how do we make sure we implement both of our agendas moving forward?
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, all protocols observed. I do believe that the presentation done by my dear colleague Hannah said it all. Our business model is broken. And I do believe that we Africans, we need to face it. We need to call, in my opinion, for a reset, a rebooting of the policy making in Africa. Something is missing in this equation. And I'm really happy that Her Excellency, the Deputy Chairperson, in her remarks, she called for the need to review business as usual. Actually, it's a strong call that the Secretary General has been saying over and over. Business as usual, for a couple of reasons, even at the multilateral level, has not been working. If we agree with me that there is a strong need to reset, to reboot, and to restart policymaking in Africa, I would like to bring to this exercise 4 conceptual notions that I do believe that we need to introduce in the policy-making production process in Africa. 4 conceptual notions, and these are basically my remarks. The first conceptual notion is that policy-making in Africa needs to distinguish generation of resources from mobilization of resources. These are 2 different animals. I have been saying, and this is in the report that has been recently approved by the General Assembly, Africa loses $500 billion annually. The breakdown is in the report, is there. Africa loses $500 billion annual. I've been saying that over and over in the past, I would say, 1 year. We cannot lose what you don't have. Artificial intelligence has not addressed that yet. So if Africa loses $500 billion, it's because Africa has been able to generate $500 billion. Africa has not been able to mobilize the $500 billion. So, and this distinction is important because the policy mix to address lack of generation of resources is completely different from the policy mix that we need to address, let's say, the mobilization of resources. And the difference, and the fact that Africa generates, but has not been able to mobilize what Africa generates, I do believe that at the end of the day, we do have a question of mindset that has been driving policymaking in Africa. This is the first conceptual notion that I'd like to bring. The second conceptual notion that I believe we need to factor in the policy-making production process in Africa is that Africa has a liquidity problem. Africa has not a solvability problem. And this is also an important distinction. Again, the policy mix to address liquidity issues are completely different of the policy mix required to address solvability issues. Completely different. And I will give, again, let's go back to this magic number of $500 billion. Africa loses $500 billion on an annual basis. In 2022, Africa's public external debt was $644 billion. So we have $500 billion that we lose on an annual basis, which is a flow, against a stock that is $644 billion, which gives me a payback period of 1 year, 0.2. So this tells me that, yes, there's a liquidity problem, because if you lose $500 billion, any household would have a liquidity problem. But we do not have a solvability problem because we prove that we can generate resources. We generate and we lose them. So, and this distinction between liquidity and solvability, credit rating agencies have not been processing it. Credit rating agencies have not been making this distinction towards Africa. And this is important because in this context, so made in Africa financial solutions must combine two dimensions. The first one is the policy mix direct to deal with the basically stress situations of national treasuries, the liquidity problem. But also, we need to come up with a policy mix to unlock countries' solvency protection. The third conceptual notion that I believe we need to bring to the policymaking production process, we need to make we need to agree that acceleration is not possible without resilience. Yesterday in a VNR, we reached the midterm of 2030 agenda. We are complete off track, Anna. Anna told us, correct? We are complete off track. And it seems that you are panic. And you start talking about it. Let's accelerate. But in the case of Africa, I have the impression, and I'm going to repeat what I said yesterday in one of the sessions, that we are in a Ferrari without tires. Can you accelerate a Ferrari without tires? I don't think so. I don't think. Because we need to also acknowledge in a very open way that we have not delivered the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. Africa has not delivered. So Africa has not built resilience to be ready to implement the SDGs. And Africa has not built resilience to be ready to accelerate the SDGs. And again, I go back to the policy mix. The policy mix to build resilience is completely different from the policy mix to accelerate. Completely. And I will give you example with school feeding that I used in Cape Verde a couple of times. So, from a policy mix standpoint, we know that resilience paves the way to a policy framework for acceleration. Let's take the example of school feeding. So, during resilience, school feeding needs to be financed by ODA, as today. Countries have no policy space to finance school feeding. But during the acceleration phase, school feeding cannot be financed by ODA. It should be financed by budget revenues. So the difference. The same program, but a different finance structure. During the resilience period, is ODA to come up, to scale up, but then down the road, budget revenues need to take over. Second example, very quickly, public goods, land access, water, energy, to address the non-monetary poverty. As you know, poverty has a monetary dimension and non-monetary dimension. So a non-monetary dimension is when public policies address land access, water, energy, etc. So, and of course, to address the non-monetary poverty is essentially a feature of the resilient phase. If you don't do that in the resilient phase, you will not be ready to address acceleration. But during the acceleration phase, once you have delivered resilience, your policy mix needs to change to financial inclusion, expansion trajectory, feeding middle class, market scale, a different package, a different package. The fourth conceptual notion is that in policy making, to survive, and again, I'm saying that because I did when the subprime hit Cape Verde in 2008, when the external shock hits your country and you are there to deliver, you have a short-term period to identify three things. If you don't identify these in this short-term period, I don't know if you'll be able to cope with the external shock. The first, you need to identify in your country a game changer. Second, you need to identify a driver. Third, you need to identify the enablers to activate the game changer and to unlock the driver. I do believe, and I have been saying that, allow me to repeat, the game changer in the case of Africa is the need to shift the paradigm of financing for development. As I said, Africa already finances more than 75% of its own development. It's not ODA, it's not FDI, it's our own resources. So we need, in terms of game changer, we need to recognize that domestic resource mobilization, not revenues, domestic resource mobilizations are the game changer. Drivers, I do believe that everybody agrees that is energy. Without energy, we don't go. And enablers, as my dear colleague Hannah mentioned, as well as our Excellency, the Deputy Chairperson, are institutions, country systems, these intangible assets. And of course, digital transformation is there to help you on this. Of course, with the adoption, and this is the last part of my statement, with the adoption of these four conceptual notions into the policy-making production process in Africa, I do believe that we can get ready to start challenge the global narrative on Africa's debt. This is a short-term homework. We need to challenge the global narrative on Africa's debt, particularly if we factor the conceptual notion 1 and 2. And I will finish with the following sentence. Yes, Africa is in debt distress. Everybody agrees. But Africa is not in debt distress because as over-debted. No. 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 Please do not accept this narrative. Africa is in debt distress because Africa does not control its own economic and financial flows, which is different. And I ask to myself, the debt to GDP ratio, 65%, 70%. But you need to build everything from A to Z. We have nothing. But it's only 7%. Let's compare to Japan. Japan has built everything. You dream Japanese. You dream Japanese. And the ratio in Japan is 200%. How come I have to build everything in my country, in my continent, and I'm over debt, and Japan has built everything with it 200%, is not over debt? You need to work hard to convince me of that. So I do believe that, yes, we are in debt distress, but we are not because we are over-debted, but because we do not control our economic and financial flows. And this brings me that, take account that in the past 40 years, Africa has undergone approximately 320 sovereign debt restructuring exercise. 320 sovereign debt restructuring exercise. I do believe that we need to also challenge what the global narrative is being adopting as debt sustainability. First, debt suspensions should be designed as initial steps of debt restructuring, which is not the case so far. Second, debt restructuring should be designed as pieces and components of domestic resource mobilization reforms. Only then debt restructuring will serve the debtors and not serve the creditors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Duarte. I'm now going to give the floor to UNDP Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa, Mrs. Ahuna Eziakonwa. Thank you.
Thank you. I think very provocative thoughts from our sister, Christina. And I'm sure that everybody was listening, but also from previous speakers. And how do I build on what has been said so far? So our brother at the end there asked a question. He posed the question, is Africa in the room as a negotiator at the seat or the meal? And our sister Christina said Africa is losing $500 billion a year of the money that it has generated. So go figure. Does that make Africa, somebody's eating, and it's not Africa that's eating. So Africa, if we're answering your question, is for the most part the meal in many of these gatherings. And how is that reflected in present day calculations? She talked a lot about the financials. I'm going to focus a little bit on the human dimension. So we have huge debates today about critical minerals as the things that will power the future, the decarbonized future, and help us get to net zero. Where are most of those minerals found? In Africa. What is the discussion today? It's about rail lines that will cut across these junctures where you find the minerals and be able to get them extracted and transported to the countries where value will then be added to them and they will be processed for use for electric vehicles and others. Where is the value created? What is left behind for those who host these minerals? Deals are being made right now. MOUs are being signed on the construction of those railway lines. How many Africans are in the room understanding the implication of each and every agreement that is signed for the populations? For the young people, 72 million young Africans who have no employment, no education, no training. What is the relevance of those critical minerals to their lives and their future? What does it mean attaining the SDGs. For 1.4 million children in the Sahel today who are out of school because of the closure of 7,800 schools in the Central Sahel as a result of insecurity and insurgency. Those kids who are between the ages of 6 and 12, primary age, in 2063, they will be in their 50s, late 40s and 50s. They will be the leaders of those countries. What is their preparation today for leadership for tomorrow? We're talking about sustainability. How can we sustain the future with those kids denied the opportunity to learn, and therefore prepare themselves for leadership of their countries of tomorrow? What does attaining the SDGs mean for 44 million of Africa's people who are displaced as we speak? Continent-wide, there are 44 million people who are not in their home areas, who are not in their ancestral homes, who are languishing in IDP camps or refugee camps. Will they feel the attainment of the SDGs by the 2030 or indeed 2063 agenda? What does it mean, attaining the SDGs, for the 1/3 of Africa's women who experience abuse of a sexual, physical nature throughout their lifetime? 1/3 of women on the continent experience abuse, with the limitations that that creates, not only for their own potential growth, but for the growth of their communities. What does achieving the SDGs mean for that population? Or for the 600 million people we heard today who have no access to electricity? What does it mean that we will attain the SDGs or the 2063 agenda or not? Or for the women, 80% of them cooking with firewood and burning their chests. And I think beyond these questions about the humanity behind the numbers is the question of how we are applying the lens of the SDGs over the continent of Africa, as if we have the same template everywhere, right? So we're in Ethiopia, over 100 million people, several ethnic groups and configurations, land-linked. What would it mean for Ethiopia? What is Ethiopia's pathway to 2030 and 2063 compared to Cape Verde? 500,000 or so people, neighborhood of Addis, ocean, large ocean country, we call them small island developing states, largely stable with good governance over the years, sustained. I don't think Cape Verde has ever experienced conflict or a war. What is Cape Verde's pathway to 2030, 2063? And I was talking to the resident coordinator earlier who said, sounds like a small country, but it has 9 islands. So if you have a water establishment here, you need 9. You need to think of 9 of them. What are the constraints in Cape Verde compared to Ethiopia or Nigeria? Eswatini, under 1 million people. You would say small country, good infrastructure, a monarch. What is their pathway to the SDGs compared to Sudan? Have we thought about countries in crisis, protracted or acute? What is their SDG journey? So I think in responding to that question, I just come up with more questions. That the way that we are approaching this is really, if you ask me, it's a bit dumb. Because and it's all of us here indicted, we're looking at this continent as if it were one thing on the same track, and we're all kind of following, running on the same path and journey. I think we need to disaggregate. We need to stop looking at Africa with one template. We need to look at the diversity of the continent with all its uniqueness, with all the dynamics and structural differences that exist, but even economic differences and realities, and social cultural context, and ask ourselves, how do we apply a lens of the SDGs and the 2063 based on these contextual realities? That what Eswatini needs to get there might be different from what Uganda needs to get there. And once we have that reflection, I think we can begin to construct in real times what needs to happen in each place. The same way we need to reconfigure the methodology and timelines for countries, say in the Sahel, countries that are strapped, countries that are not even in control of half their territory as we speak. You cannot imagine that our pathways that we're deploying would have the same application in those places. So we have to rethink, what does the SDG achievement or 2063 mean for Burkina Faso? Yeah? Thank you.
Thank you also very much, Ms. Ahuna Eziakonwa, for these remarks and for reminding us that when we speak of SDGs, we speak of people, and like you said, a diverse set of people across a diverse continent. We don't have much time, unfortunately. It's always the way that these kinds of conversation go. I'm going to throw the same question to the last panelist that's with us. He's on Zoom, and he can hopefully hear me. Group President and Managing Director, Eastern and Southern African Trade and Development Bank, Admasu Tadesse. If you can hear me, we're just setting up this conversation around eradicating poverty and implementing SDGs, and hearing from your perspective, how can we implement these SDGs and accelerate them?
Great. Thank you, Madam Moderator, and greetings to everybody. Very happy to be in this very interesting panel. I guess I'm going to take Ahuna's approach and just build on the very interesting conversation that's been taking place. My first reaction, of course, is that the diagnostics, the perspectives are truly profound and indeed very provocative. My angle I'd like to take is maybe what we should perhaps do is disaggregate the approach, as I think Ahuna again mentioned. There's a geographic disaggregation. What I like to do sometimes is identify the spaces where we have more control to do what we can do within our own immediate environments, versus the very complicated issues that, of course, requires advocacy and policy engagement, but not always very easy to get movement on the ground. So what I found very interesting was the comment that Dr. Monique made in her opening remarks around experience with CADIP and the scorecards. And what I found so interesting about that particular remark was how we've begun to find our way into robust implementation, because the truth is, I think as speakers have alluded to, the know what is not the problem. I think Africa has gotten to a level of sophistication of knowing very well what the issues are, what the problems are, the diagnostics. I think to some extent, I would say it's a half story here where we have a little bit of know-how, but our big problem is know how to do, right? So we're very good at the analytics and the diagnostics. And I think the scorecarding approach to experience with CADIP is the way to go. And I think the bottom line in all of this, I find, of course, as a financier myself, is that, we've got to learn to accept that the storms will continue to rage. And as they continue to rage with shocks and crises, we have to learn to walk in the rain and run in the rain. And walking and running in the rain is all about finding those spaces where you can move the needle within your own space. And I think Christina talked a lot about us mobilizing our own resources and all of that. And I think that is very critical. There's a lot of very interesting opportunities in this day and age around blended finance. There's a lot of opportunities around impact finance and also public-private partnerships. These are three particular themes that I'd like to highlight as being ways and means in which we can get more traction in implementing the agenda of sustainable poverty reduction, because we know that if we don't get the production side moving, the value chains and the value addition to move, we will always be just papering over the cracks. So my focus in the work that we do at TDB Group is to try to really just get some serious traction in those areas where we think we have a manageable interest. And the manageable interest is on these types of areas. And we've managed to grow our balance sheet, not from billions to trillions, but I think from 1 billion to many billions. And we're continuing to do that. And we're focusing on African institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies. Again, to Christina's point, not always looking outside, looking inside, but then doing the leveraging at the same time to bring global resources on the back of domestic resources. And again, I think the one conference that I think would be very interesting would be to find 10 CADEPs, and put the spotlight on what's been working and what approaches and tactics have been employed and who's found some kind of formula how to get the needle to move on the ground. Because I think there's so much consensus that we're so good at doing the analytics 10,000 feet above the ground. But the question is, who can get movement on the ground? And we do have success stories in Africa, apart from CADEP-like experiences at the sectoral level. We have countries that have managed to get quite a lot done. Mauritius, Rwanda are cases in point. Morocco is another. There's quite a few experiences. And I think it would be very interesting just to highlight what is it that these countries have done that's within their manageable interest, where they're learning how to walk and run in the rain despite the paradoxes, the contradictions, and the multiple shocks that are always coming our way. And so I kind of like to be a little bit practical sometimes to say, to keep my motivation going, I need to just find out where we can focus our action to get things to move on the ground. Because in the end, if we don't take control of our own destinies through action, we will always be sharing perspective at a conceptual level. We do need the conceptual perspectives. We do need the diagnostics, but I think it'd be great to have much more focus on the micro level environments where action actually takes place, and drawing on the lessons, the emulation that Dr. Monique spoke about, and sort of building on that side of things while we grapple with the bigger global contradictions. Those will always be there, and from what we hear, might even get worse as we go ahead. So we've got to find our own spaces to get things done, and sort of build some motivation around that, create some positive stories, and then we'll be surprised that global resources will flow even more to us as we start to demonstrate that we have our own houses in order. So maybe I'll just stop there. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tadesse, for your very interesting points. As I mentioned before you started talking, we only have a few minutes before we have to wrap up. This is incredibly frustrating, but this is how we have to go about things. We have a much more conversations coming up on the rest of the day. I think that the question that I threw to all of our panelists was partially touched on, because as Mr. Tadesse mentioned, we are very good at diagnostic and analysis, and I think we all did that, and we did a lot of reflection. Some of you did mention some key actions that can be taken moving forward, but since we only have a few minutes left, I want to once again give every single panelist the opportunity to maybe give us one main takeaway, one key action that they would like for us to focus as Africa as a whole, or maybe as specific regions or countries, because it is a difficult answer to respond in a very a linear way. So I'll just again open this time. We'll start with Ahuna, if you could start with the main key action and also main takeaway from this discussion.
Thank you. I go with Tadesse, who is a proud UNDP influencer for development. Great to see you, Tadesse. And I think she said something important. There are some things that we're in control of. You know, the world is very complicated, polarized, everything, and we can keep harping on that until the cows come home. But as we're in this room today, we should start to get into the plumbing side. What are the things that we're in control of and the tools that we have to work with? I think one of them is governance. You know, today, all African countries can say that they are free politically and that they have the control, they can have agency and the control to exercise the right kind of governance that does not allow Africa to lose $500 billion a year. So it's very important to deliver on strong institutions, to deliver on the agency of the people, their right to exercise their agency, to deliver on basic services. That's governance. And we saw what happened in Senegal recently, and it's important to mention that, where you see a combination of forces, civil society that's active, institutions that are competent and listening, and delivering a transition that we can all be proud of. So governance, I think, is key. Energy, already mentioned. If we tackle energy, and there are many things we can do, we don't have to wait for all communities to get on the national grid. We can mobilize around renewables. Africa still has 60% of the world's best solar resources. And mini-grids, and UNDP is investing in mini-grids. We have the Africa Mini-Grids program, which is targeting millions of Africans in rural communities to get access to electricity. When you tackle energy, you tackle a lot of things, GBV, clean cooking, education, learning. You tackle health outcomes that can become better, innovation, connectivity. Without energy, we can't have connectivity that bring innovation that then helps create jobs. And lastly is investment in youth. I think this is critical. The youngest region in the world, we are ignoring young people as if they are a marginal issue that we just need to tackle because they are time bomb waiting to explode. They are an ally for the kind of development we're looking for, and UNDP is betting on them with a new program that we're calling Timbuktu to spark a startup revolution on the continent, because here is where we're seeing the talent of young Africans able to transform the development landscape in terms of challenges in all sectors. So I think we invest in young people massively as architects of the development of the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Duarte.
Very quickly. The four conceptual notions at the end of the day was, I tried to structure as a strong call to increase the levels of exercise of ownership in Africa. And I do believe that I have seen this narrative over and over, even in the reports, that Africa's policy framework are very good, are strong. Our problem is implementation. Let's move to action. And sometimes trying to explain the lack of implementation with technicalities or the absence of technicalities. I personally have some difficulty in accepting this explanation. Please allow me, and my apologies up front. We need to understand why you have not been delivering. And it's not a lack of technicalities. It's not. There are solutions that have been in the shelves for more than 20 years. I can give you one. Azikuda, UNCTAD, to tackle trade mispricing. How much we lose on an annual basis on trade mispricing in Africa? $60 billion. The technicality is there. The solution has been in the shelf. What is the missing piece? And allow me to give an example of food systems that I had the opportunity to say yesterday. Why you have been unable to unlock a process of food systems transformation in Africa, and today has become a paradox. We are rich in agricultural resources, but in food insecurity. Why? Because I do believe that, and please, if I'm wrong, I'm completely open to different opinions. I do believe that until now, policy making on food systems in Africa have not featured, in my opinion, a very small but important feature. Food systems today in Africa have a geopolitical dimension. What is that? It's simple. By 2050, the world will have more 2.5 billion people that needs to be fed. What is the continent best place to be in that equation? Africa. So food systems transformation goes beyond the African continent as a geopolitical dimension. If we don't factor it in the design of our policy making, in 10 years we'll be talking about food systems transformation. So I do believe that we need to understand, and I want to mention, what is the constellation of external factors and internal factors, so when we design our mixed policies, we should directly hit the point. Thank you.
Very much for your thoughts. I'm going now to throw it to you, Mr. Minister of State for Planning and Development.
I think it's really difficult to speak after these, great speakers. And I think one of the things I can draw, from the conversations we had, the issue of really prioritizing. What could Africa really influence? Of course, given the heterogeneities between, African states. The first most important thing to me as a policymaker is what can an African states using their own agency could influence is the most priority. In that regard, I think we can talk, of course, the food system, transformation, as much as it is, external influencer, the global financial structure, the trade structure is affecting that. I think the farmers at stake could really, require that, and I think focusing on food, focusing on those, basic infrastructures that, our agency, our own, individual agency could influence is really important. Of course, most of all the goals and aspirations that we speak are equally important. Technology is important, energy is important, health and education is important, food is important, all, goals are important, but what can we really influence to bring, a transformative goal is, is an important, dimension to it. The second most important, I think, such platforms should recognize for African states is looking into the multilateral approach of strengthening, collective action to influence regional and global, financial actors that we speak, because most of the external influences are outside Africa's reach, outside most of, developing economies, and what kind of multilateral, platform should we really aspire as African nations to really, bring those changes. But, things that can influence in our own context should also really get, attention, policy attention and development planning attention in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. So
Yeah, so I started on very negative note, and also, as usual, with the lamentations. So I'll be now positive. And one, I speak from where His Excellency has left. Where we stand now in the global geopolitical interactions, Africa is like that very beautiful girl who is being, enticed from several areas. And now it is our time now to decide which way do we want to go? And this is it. I want to believe that were it not for the BRICS, the emergence of the BRICS, Africa could not be invited to be the 21st member of the G20. That's a fact. And so, in that tug of war, in really enticing this very beautiful girl, we can take advantage of that and say we want the reform of global international financial architecture, and that will be delivered. I think that is positive, and that's the answer. Number two is about our resources. The transition to low carbon, climate resilient future is inevitable. And this being the case, Amina Mohammed mentioned that we have 46 trillion worth of resources, critical minerals, lithium, copper, and all these, coltan, and all these which are driving the new technology on renewables. Call it solar energy, call it the electric vehicles, call them, you see, wind power. We have those resources to drive the future. How do we add value on those resources so that they can create a job for the millions of youths who are no jobs and those others? So we have an opportunity. We have institutions, African Free Trade Area agreement, and all those. So why can't we really rise to the occasion and believe in our institutions? The most important thing, which we do not have, is that we are very good in establishing institutions. We are very good in setting policies, setting strategies, everything. What we lack is implementation. And we have resources to do that. And in terms of energy, we are very happy. Imagine, in the last 2 days, we launched a campaign, 630 campaign. And we are inviting, I'm very happy, UNDP is in this, and all of us, we have several initiatives on energy. And how do we ensure that we ensure the 630 million people in Africa who have no energy get it? And I think for the interest of time, I think we are going to build those partnerships with UNDP and those other allies, and I believe that through that, we are going to bequeath the future to the future generation, which we are going to make them happy. We need three things. One, how do we address the question of sustainability, human well-being, and environment, because all of them are interconnected. Once we arrive on that, I believe we are going to provide solution to the world. I think the solution to the world, all these difficult geopolitical problems are going to be solved by Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this optimistic note. And one more panelist to finish us off, Mr. Admasu Addis, if you can hear me. Just one key action.
Yeah, I'll just leave the panel and the audience with one final remark, and that is to say, as we digest all this complexity, I think that what I find very useful is to ask myself the question, how easy is it to close the gap at the macro level versus the meso and the micro level? And the bottom line is we have a lot more room to maneuver at the micro and meso level as opposed to the big macro level, because the macro level gaps are not there for lack of knowledge. We have all these contradictions and gaps at the big macro level because of interests and design. So it's not about knowledge. So that's why I like to focus at the meso and micro level in the continent, because there, at least, the gaps that we face, we have a better chance of closing them, right? So, I mean, I work on the ground. I've been working in this industry for 25 years. There's a great deal that we need to do on the ground. And we've seen examples of countries that have managed to deal with the gaps at the micro and meso level, the institutional level. I think we have a lot of institutions that exist. We have a lot of policies that have been, designed, and they do reflect best practice and all of that. But in reality, this thing of implementation, it's not just talk, right? I think Africans, we know, our Achilles heel. Our Achilles heel is we really need to be better organized and better disciplined at the level of the spaces that we have a better chance of of controlling. The other spaces are very important as well. I don't belittle the need for advocacy and engagement at a much larger level. But I think we need to be cognizant that we shouldn't assume it's for lack of knowledge. It's not because of that. I think those of us who've seen the biggest generation of global resources in the past 4 years, it was the special drawing rights of the IMF, where $65 billion were created overnight. And ask yourself how much of that was allocated to Africa. It's a structural problem. Everybody's talked about reallocating these resources, but there's no reallocation. So I kind of like to be humble and say to myself, it's not for lack of knowledge at that level. It's just there's no will. There's no will, and you can't move the needle very easily. Of course, you can advocate, and there may be opportunities that opens up to ease things a bit. But in the final analysis, the premium is on executing at home and at least closing the gaps where you have a chance of doing that. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your closing remarks. And that will wrap up HLP 1, which was focused on stepping up ambition and innovative solutions to eradicate poverty and reinforce the 2 agendas that we are talking about as part of this forum. Thank you so much to our brilliant and esteemed panelists, the Minister of State for Planning and Development of Ethiopia, the Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Africa, Mrs. Duarte, the UNDP Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa, Mrs. Ahuna Isiakonwa, the Executive Director for Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, Mr. Mitika Mwenda, and the Group President and Managing Director of Eastern and Southern African Trade and Development Bank, Mr. Admasu Tadese. Thank you all for your presence here, and thank you all for your attention.